Rain had been falling across Chicago since the afternoon. The streets looked cold and shiny beneath the gray sky, while soft wind pushed water droplets against apartment windows all over the city. I pulled my hoodie tighter while climbing the stairs toward Jason's apartment, already annoyed that he hadn't replied to my messages all day. That wasn't normal for him. Jason was the type of person who answered texts within seconds, even if the message was completely useless. But today, nothing. No replies. No calls. Just silence. I knocked twice against the apartment door. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then suddenly I heard movement inside. Fast movement. Like somebody almost tripped over something. My eyebrows lifted immediately. What the hell? A few seconds later, the door opened slightly. Jason stood there looking stressed for absolutely no reason. His hair was messy. His face looked nervous, and he was breathing slightly heavier than normal, like I'd interrupted something important. The second he saw me, his eyes widened. You didn't say you were coming. I laughed softly. Since when do I need an appointment? Jason forced a quick smile, but something about it looked unnatural. No, I just wasn't expecting anybody. That sentence immediately made me suspicious. I pushed the door open further and walked inside before he could stop me. The apartment felt weirdly warm compared to cold, rainy weather outside. Soft music played quietly somewhere in the background, and the living room lights were dim, like somebody had been relaxing before I arrived. Or hiding. Jason quickly closed the door behind me. You okay? I asked while dropping onto the couch casually. Yeah. Why? You look like the police just raided your house. Jason laughed nervously. I'm fine. He definitely was not fine. I noticed immediately that he kept glancing toward his bedroom every few seconds. That only made me more curious. So, I said slowly, narrowing my eyes. What's going on? Nothing. Jason. Seriously, nothing. I leaned back against the couch, watching him carefully. We've been friends for years. I knew exactly how he acted when he was lying. And right now, this man looked terrified. Before I could say anything else, I suddenly heard a quiet sound from somewhere deeper inside the apartment. Like movement. Jason froze instantly. I noticed immediately. Bro, I muttered slowly. Why are you acting like somebody's hiding in here? No one's hiding. Another sound came from the hallway, this time louder. Jason closed his eyes for half a second, like his soul physically left his body. I stared at him in complete disbelief. No way. It's not what you think. That's exactly what people say before it becomes exactly what I think. Jason rubbed his face stressed. Can you relax for 2 minutes? Not until you explain why your apartment suddenly feels like a crime scene. Jason sighed heavily before walking toward his bedroom. I followed immediately behind him, despite him clearly not wanting me to. The bedroom door stood half open. The room itself looked normal at first glance, except for one thing. Jason's bed. There was a large blanket pulled completely over somebody lying underneath it, completely still. I stopped walking, then slowly looked toward Jason. He looked like he wanted the earth to open beneath him. Jason, it's not weird. That depends entirely on what's on the blanket. Jason groaned dramatically. Can you not make this worse? At this point, curiosity completely took over my brain. Without thinking too hard, I stepped closer and grabbed part of the blanket. Jason immediately panicked. Wait. Too late. I pulled the blanket down slightly and instantly froze. For one shocked second, my brain stopped working completely. There was clearly another person hiding there. The room became painfully silent. Jason looked horrified. I looked confused. And whoever was under the blanket looked ready to disappear from existence entirely. I immediately dropped the blanket back down. Okay, I muttered awkwardly while stepping backward. I definitely walked into something. Jason covered his face with both hands. This is a disaster. Honestly, I didn't even know what to say anymore. The entire situation felt unreal. Trying to escape the awkwardness for a second, I rubbed the back of my neck and looked toward the hallway. I'm gonna use the bathroom. Jason nodded way too quickly. Yeah, good idea. I walked out of the bedroom, still trying to process what I had just seen. Nothing about tonight made sense anymore. When I reached the bathroom, I pushed the door open halfway, then froze again. Someone else was inside. A young guy stood near the sink looking completely panicked after seeing me. He was tall, quiet-looking, and honestly ridiculously attractive in a soft, effortless way. Dark hair slightly messy, oversized hoodie, nervous eyes. For a second we just stared at each other in complete silence. Neither of us expected this interaction. I finally said intelligently. The guy looked even more nervous somehow. "Sorry," he muttered quietly like he'd done something wrong. I blinked in confusion. Wait, now I was even more confused than before. I stepped back into the hallway. Immediately. "Jason!" My voice sounded much calmer than I actually felt. Jason appeared from the bedroom, already looking exhausted. I pointed toward the bathroom slowly. "Who is that?" Jason stayed silent for a second, then finally sighed heavily. "That's Ethan." I stared at him. "And why exactly is Ethan hiding in your bathroom?" Jason rubbed his forehead tiredly before answering quietly. "Because he'd panic when you showed up." I looked between Jason and the bathroom in complete disbelief. Then suddenly the entire situation became weirdly funny. I started laughing. Not because I understood anything, because the awkwardness reached a level my brain genuinely couldn't process anymore. Jason looked offended immediately. "You're enjoying this way too much." "I walked into your apartment and discovered a hidden human being," I replied while still laughing. "What reaction did you expect?" Even Jason started laughing weakly after that. And somehow, in the middle of all the confusion, nervousness, and awkward silence, the strange night was only beginning. After the awkward shock finally settled down, the apartment slowly became calmer again. Jason convinced Ethan to come out of the bathroom, instead of hiding like a wanted criminal. At first, Ethan looked extremely uncomfortable walking back into the living room, avoiding eye contact while sitting carefully on the far side of the couch. Honestly, I almost felt bad for him. The poor guy looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him alive. Jason handed him a drink before sitting beside him protectively. "Can everybody please act normal now?" Jason muttered tiredly. I laughed softly while leaning back against a chair nearby. "You realize I walked into your apartment and discovered 2 hidden people in different rooms." Jason pointed toward me dramatically. "And you're still making this worse." Ethan quietly smiled for the first time hearing that. The smile completely changed his face somehow. Before this moment he looked nervous and guarded, but smiling made him seem softer, warmer, more real. Rain continued tapping gently against the apartment windows, while soft music played quietly in the background. The awkwardness slowly faded as conversation started becoming natural again. At first, we mostly joked about how ridiculous the situation looked from my perspective. I genuinely thought Jason kidnapped somebody. I admitted. Jason looked offended immediately. "Wow, you were acting suspicious. Because you appeared out of nowhere." Ethan laughed quietly beside him, shaking his head. "You really did panic, though." Jason pointed dramatically again. "Thank you for betraying me." The atmosphere finally started feeling comfortable after that. Ethan slowly relaxed more during conversations, speaking more openly instead of nervously apologizing every 2 seconds. And the more he talked, the more I realized he wasn't anything like I expected. He was quieter than Jason, calmer too. But there was something about him that naturally pulled attention anyway. Not because he tried hard, because he listened carefully whenever someone spoke, because his smile looked genuine, because underneath his nervousness, there was kindness in the way he talked to people. At some point, Jason stood up to order food from a nearby restaurant, leaving me and Ethan briefly alone again. This time the silence didn't feel awkward, just unfamiliar. Ethan glanced toward the rain-covered windows before speaking softly. "Sorry again about earlier." I smiled slightly. "You don't have to apologize." He laughed weakly under his breath. "I was literally hiding in a bathroom." Fair point. That made him smile again. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke afterward. Then finally I asked carefully, "So, how long have you known Jason?" Ethan leaned back slightly against the couch. "About 8 months." "Seriously?" He nodded once. "We met through mutual friends." Something about the way he answered felt careful. Not dishonest, just protective, like he was used to thinking too hard before saying certain things out loud. I noticed it immediately, and strangely, it made me curious about him even more. Jason never mentioned you before. I admitted. Ethan smiled faintly. I think he was nervous. Honestly, hearing that affected me more than expected, because Jason and I had been friends for years. The idea that he hid something important from me made me realize how scared he probably felt about being judged. Before I could say anything else, Jason returned carrying snacks and immediately interrupted the emotional atmosphere. "Good news," he announced dramatically. "We're ordering pizza because nobody here knows how to cook." "That's definitely your fault," I replied. The evening slowly became warmer after that. The rain outside grew heavier while the apartment itself felt strangely calm and isolated from the rest of the city. We ate pizza on the living room floor, argued about terrible movies, and spent nearly 40 minutes making fun of Jason's old college haircut after I found embarrassing photos on his phone. Even Ethan laughed hard at those pictures. "Delete those immediately," Jason demanded. "Never," I replied proudly. For the first time all night, Ethan genuinely looked relaxed now, comfortable, at ease. And honestly, I found myself paying attention to him more and more without realizing it. The way he quietly smiled during conversations, the softness in his voice, the way his eyes lit up whenever he laughed unexpectedly. Somewhere during the night, my curiosity slowly became emotional interest, and that realization scared me slightly. Around midnight, the apartment lights dimmed slightly while thunder echoed outside across the city. Jason disappeared briefly into the kitchen, searching for drinks again, leaving me sitting beside Ethan on the couch. The room felt quieter now, more personal somehow. Ethan stared toward the rain outside for a moment before speaking softly. "You know something?" "What?" "I honestly thought tonight was going to end terribly." I laughed quietly. "Same." "No, seriously," he continued. "I'm not good at meeting new people." I looked toward him carefully. "That's hard to believe." He smiled faintly. "Why?" "You seem calm." Ethan looked down briefly before answering. "That's because I learned how to hide nervousness well." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. For the first time tonight, I noticed loneliness hidden underneath his calm personality. Not dramatic loneliness. Quiet loneliness. The kind people carry silently for years. I leaned back against the couch slowly. "I think everybody hides parts of themselves." Ethan looked toward me again. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. "Some people just get tired of hiding eventually." The sentence lingered heavily between us, because suddenly this conversation wasn't just casual anymore. It was honest, real. The rain outside softened into a quieter rhythm, while warm apartment lights reflected gently across the room around us. Jason eventually returned from the kitchen, carrying drinks. But even after conversations became playful again, something between me and Ethan had already changed. Not openly, not dramatically, but enough for both of us to notice. At one point later that night, Jason fell asleep sideways on the opposite couch after eating too much pizza and complaining about life for nearly an hour straight. Ethan laughed quietly while pulling a blanket over him. "He's impossible." Completely. For a second we both stood there looking at Jason, sleeping like an exhausted child. Then Ethan suddenly smiled softly. "I'm glad you came tonight." After that night at Jason's apartment, everything started feeling different. Not immediately. At first, life continued normally on the surface. Classes, work, late-night scrolling, coffee shops, traffic, the usual routine. But somewhere underneath all of that, my thoughts kept drifting back toward Ethan. Small moments replayed inside my head at random times. The way he smiled quietly during conversations, how nervous he looked when I first opened the bathroom door, the softness in his voice whenever he talked honestly about himself. It didn't make sense to me. I barely knew him. Yet somehow, he stayed stuck in my mind constantly. A few days later, Jason invited me out for coffee after class. The weather had finally cleared after nearly a week of rain, and downtown Chicago looked brighter beneath the afternoon sunlight. The second I sat down across from him, Jason smirked suspiciously. "You've been weird." I frowned slightly. What does that even mean? You know exactly what it means. I really don't. Jason leaned back in his chair dramatically. You keep asking about Ethan. I immediately looked away toward the cafe windows. I asked like twice. 3 times, Jason corrected. That's still normal. Jason stared at me for a few seconds before laughing quietly. Oh no. What? You like him? My stomach tightened instantly. That's not. It absolutely is. I rubbed my forehead tiredly. This conversation is already annoying. Jason laughed again, but after a moment his expression softened slightly. You know, he admitted quieter this time, I was honestly scared to introduce you too. That answer caught me off guard. Why? Jason stirred his coffee absent-mindedly. I don't know. He shrugged lightly. People change sometimes when they find out things about you. For a second I didn't know what to say, because suddenly I understood something important. Jason wasn't only nervous that night because he got caught hiding somebody in his apartment. He was scared of losing friendships. Scared people would see him differently afterward. The realization made guilt settle quietly in my chest. I looked toward him carefully. You know I'd never judge you, right? Jason smiled faintly. Yeah, he replied softly. I know that now. That conversation stayed in my head for the rest of the day. And somehow after hearing it, my thoughts about Ethan became even more complicated. Because now this wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was emotional, personal. A few nights later, Ethan texted me unexpectedly around midnight. You awake? I stared at the message for 2 seconds before replying instantly. Yeah. His response came quickly. Couldn't sleep? Somehow that simple conversation turned into 3 straight hours of messaging. Music recommendations, childhood memories, bad relationships, anxiety, loneliness. The more we talked, the easier everything felt between us. Too easy. That was the dangerous part. At around 3 a.m., Ethan suddenly sent, Honestly, I'm glad you walked into Jason's apartment that night. I smiled at my screen without realizing it. Even after the bathroom disaster? Especially after the bathroom disaster. I laughed quietly to myself. But underneath the humor, something deeper was growing now between us. And both of us felt it. Over the next few weeks, Ethan and I started talking almost every day. Sometimes casually, sometimes emotionally, sometimes about absolutely nothing important at all. But somewhere during those conversations, I started depending on them more than I should have. That terrified me, because emotional attachment had never been easy for me either. And honestly, I wasn't even fully sure what these feelings meant yet. The confusion slowly became exhausting. One evening, Jason noticed immediately. The 3 of us sat together at a small diner downtown, while neon lights reflected across the windows outside. Ethan was talking about some terrible movie he watched recently when Jason suddenly interrupted. You two realize you stare at each other like emotionally confused married people? Both of us nearly choked at the same time. Jason, Ethan muttered warningly. What? I'm just observing. I grabbed a French fry and threw it at him instantly. You're unbelievable. Jason looked proud of himself. But after the jokes faded, the awkward tension between me and Ethan stayed behind. Because deep down, Jason wasn't completely wrong. And we both knew it. Things became harder after that. Not worse exactly. Just emotionally heavier. Suddenly, every conversation between me and Ethan felt more noticeable, more real. Every accidental touch. Every moment of eye contact, every late-night message. Neither of us fully understood what to do with any of it. Then rumors started. Small ones at first. Mutual friends casually asking weird questions. People joking about how much time Ethan and I spent together lately. Nothing openly cruel, but enough to make everything feel uncomfortable. One night, Ethan became unusually quiet while we walked together beside the river downtown. Cold wind moved across the water, while city lights reflected beneath the dark sky. You ever get tired of people watching everything? He asked suddenly. I looked toward him. All the time. Ethan shoved his hands deeper into his jacket pockets. I spent most of my life hiding parts of myself from people. He laughed weakly. Sometimes I think I forgot how to stop. The sadness in his voice hit me harder than expected. I slowed my steps slightly beside him. You don't have to hide around me. Ethan looked toward me for a second longer than usual, and honestly, the emotion in his eyes scared me a little. Not because it felt wrong, because it felt important. Too important. A few days later, things became even more complicated. Ethan started pulling away emotionally. Replies became slower, conversations shorter. Some nights he disappeared completely without explanation. At first, I tried pretending it didn't bother me, but it did, more than I wanted to admit. Eventually, I confronted Jason about it while helping him move furniture inside his apartment. Did I do something wrong? I asked quietly. Jason stopped moving instantly. With Ethan, I nodded once. Jason sighed heavily before sitting down on the couch. No, he answered honestly. He's just scared. Of what? Jason looked toward me carefully. Of getting attached. That answer stayed painfully quiet between us, because deep down, I realized I was scared of the exact same thing. Later that night, Ethan finally called me after nearly 2 days of silence. His voice sounded exhausted the second I answered. A week later, everything finally reached a point where pretending became impossible. The distance between me and Ethan had turned exhausting for both of us. Every conversation felt unfinished. Every silence felt heavy. Even Jason had stopped making jokes about the situation because he could tell how emotionally tense things had become. One Friday night, Jason texted both of us, "Come over. We need to talk before you two emotionally collapse." Honestly, he wasn't wrong. Rain covered Chicago again that evening while a cold wind moved through the empty streets outside. By the time I reached Jason's apartment, the city lights reflected across wet sidewalks beneath the dark sky. When Jason opened the door, he immediately looked at me seriously. No fighting. I wasn't planning to fight anybody. Good, he muttered, because Ethan already looked stressed enough for all three of us. I stepped inside quietly. Ethan sat near the living room window wearing a dark hoodie, staring toward the rain outside while soft music played quietly in the background. The second he looked up at me, something inside my chest tightened painfully, because despite all the confusion recently, seeing him still felt familiar, comfortable, important. Jason glanced between both of us dramatically. "Okay," he announced. "I'm making coffee. You two fix your emotional issues." Before either of us could respond, he disappeared into the kitchen. The apartment suddenly felt very quiet. For a few seconds, neither me nor Ethan spoke. Then finally Ethan sighed softly. "I've been handling this badly." I leaned against the opposite couch slowly. "Yeah, I admit it honestly. You have." Surprisingly, that made him laugh quietly. I deserve that. The tension between us eased slightly after that. Not gone completely, but softer now, more honest. Rain tapped gently against the apartment windows while distant thunder echoed across the city. Ethan rubbed his hands together nervously before speaking again. "I think I spent so much time trying not to get attached to people." He paused briefly. "That when it finally happened, I panicked." I stayed quiet, letting him continue. Ethan looked down toward the floor. "Meeting you wasn't supposed to matter this much." The sincerity in his voice immediately broke through every bit of frustration I'd been holding on to all week, because deep down, I understood exactly what he meant. I sat down across from him slowly. "You know what the worst part is?" Ethan looked toward me carefully. I tried convincing myself this connection was temporary. I laughed weakly under my breath. That eventually I'd stop thinking about you so much. And I shook my head slightly. Didn't work. For the first time all night, Ethan smiled properly again. Not forced, not nervous, just genuine. And honestly, seeing that smile again felt like finally breathing normally after holding tension for days. Jason suddenly reappeared carrying coffee mugs while watching both of us suspiciously. "Oh, wow," he muttered dramatically. "You're communicating like emotionally healthy people now." I grabbed a pillow and threw it at him instantly. Jason laughed while sitting in the chair nearby. But after a few moments, even his expression softened slightly. "You know," he admitted quietly, "I was terrified you'd both disappear from my life after all this." The room became quieter after that, because suddenly this wasn't only about me and Ethan anymore. Jason had been carrying fear too. Fear of losing friendships. Fear of being judged differently. Fear of letting people see important parts of his life. I looked toward him carefully. That was never going to happen. Jason smiled faintly. Yeah, he said softly. I know that now. For a while, the three of us just talked honestly. No pretending. No avoiding difficult conversations. Just honesty. Ethan opened up about how lonely life became after years of hiding important parts of himself from people. Jason admitted how exhausting it felt, constantly worrying about what others might think. And eventually I admitted something too. Meeting Ethan had changed me emotionally in ways I never expected. Not dramatically, not instantly, but enough to make me question why I spent so much of my own life emotionally guarded too. At some point, Jason stretched dramatically before standing up. All right, he announced proudly. I'm ordering food because this became emotionally exhausting. You say that like you weren't the one forcing conversations. I replied, I'm basically a therapist. You absolutely are not. Ethan laughed quietly beside me again, and somehow that simple sound immediately made the apartment feel warmer. Later that night, Jason eventually disappeared into his bedroom after claiming he was emotionally retiring for the evening, leaving me and Ethan alone in the living room again. But this time the silence between us felt completely different. Calm, safe, no confusion hiding underneath it anymore. Rain continued falling softly outside, while city lights glowed through the apartment windows. Ethan leaned back against the couch quietly. You know something? What? I'm glad you walked into that apartment that night. I smiled immediately. Even after the world's most awkward bathroom situation, he laughed softly. Even after that. For a second, we just looked at each other, quietly, while soft music filled the room around us. Then Ethan spoke again, much softer this time. I don't want to keep running away every time something feels real. The honesty in his voice settled deeply inside my chest, because that was exactly what I needed to hear too. I moved slightly closer beside him on the couch. You don't have to. Outside, rainwater rolled slowly down the windows while Chicago lights shimmered beneath the stormy night sky. And somewhere in that quiet apartment, between difficult conversations, vulnerability, and honesty, everything finally became clear. This connection wasn't something either of us needed to fear anymore. For the first time since all of this began, we stopped treating emotions like something dangerous. And instead of running from uncertainty, we finally chose each other honestly,